Hello, welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about whether or not governments, specifically the US government, will make crypto illegal. There was a congressman this week who was kind of quoted in the press alluding to that, and it brought up some blog posts from a woman named Kendra Hill from a couple of years ago where she claimed that governments worldwide would make crypto illegal. So let's break that down and what my predictions are and how this will play out. Hey, welcome to the show. My name is Molly Elmore. Today we're going to talk about the future of money, specifically whether or not US government and potentially other governments in the world will make cryptocurrencies illegal. There's quite a bit of fear being touted around this topic. A couple of years ago, a woman named Kendra Hill made this claim in a blog post that worldwide governments would make crypto illegal, and her argument was that it just doesn't serve them to have any kind of competition. As many things in this world are complicated, this is no exception, and it's not quite that simple, in my opinion, on whether or not governments would make crypto illegal. So let's break that down. All right, first thing is this also came into the news this week with a US banking chair, so not just a little low-level player in the world of government. He floated the idea of banning crypto in the United States during an appearance on Meet the Press. He kind of backtracked on it a little bit, stating that it probably wouldn't make sense because people could kind of move offshore. But I have some pretty strong opinions on this, and namely that it doesn't really serve the interests of the US banking system to make crypto illegal. And what am I talking about? All right. So let's sort of get away from this word crypto for a second. I'm actually really not a fan of that word at all, to be honest. I think it has come to have a specific connotation. It's generally now associated with kind of speculative investments, some shadiness, and this idea that these sort of magic currencies are created out of nothing, similar to the fiat money system. And it kind of gives this very broad group of technological tools a specific meaning that I don't think is accurate. So let's refer to this now as distributed ledger technology, blockchain technology, and this very interesting idea that's been sort of stated for a while, that this version of technology is going to revolutionize the internet, and we can call this the internet of value. So up until now, up until blockchain technology, you couldn't send money through the internet. Like, I know that many people didn't get that, and I didn't really understand that either until I got into this space, was that if I send you money, even through PayPal, I'm not actually sending you money. We're just having a discussion. We are messaging each other and communicating about a transaction. In the same way that if I were to send you an invoice and you paid that invoice, you don't actually get the money right away. It takes a couple of days for your bank to actually credit your account. And brings up the idea of what Swift does. Swift is essentially a version of invoicing software where it is communicating information about transactions, but the actual money itself is still being moved via very old school methods using correspondent banks in some cases and what are called nostro vostro accounts. All right, when it comes to government regulation, and this is not unique to crypto or anything we're talking about today, this is very broad, is that sadly, the role of government regulation is to protect the interests of the incumbent. This is not a new idea. Years ago, I used to have this soap making business, and we made all sorts of bath and body products like lotion and bath bombs and all that stuff. And around the time when I had this business, there was some legislation pending in Congress that was going to require anybody who made lotion and some of these other products that have water in them, we were going to have to get each batch of products tested, and you were going to have to pay this fee. I don't remember exactly what it is, but let's just say it was $100 fee for every batch of lotion that you make. Now, if you are a factory like Procter and Gamble has or Unilever has, to pay $100 fee when you're making 20,000 bottles of lotion at a time isn't really a big deal. But if you are a small manufacturer like I was, and we would make maybe like 20 bottles of lotion at a time, for me to pay this fee and to have each batch tested was going to be cost prohibitive. And what interestingly came out as we kind of dug into this legislation, and I don't think it ended up passing, which is good, is that it really was designed to let the incumbent large packaged goods companies block new entrants from getting to the point where they were a threat. There was some legalese in this rule that very, very tiny manufacturers like I was at the time were exempt from it because we were really not a threat. I was selling at like farmers markets and some stores in my area. So I think there was like a cutoff maybe of like $200,000 a year in revenue. However, once you got above that point, you now were in a situation where you could be a threat to the incumbent. You might get big enough that you could be something like the next Lush or the next Body Shop or some of these larger bath product businesses that had their own retail stores. They were, building presence in local malls. This was a few years ago, as well as creating very solid and successful online e-commerce programs. These businesses are a threat to the incumbent. And so this legislation looked very much like a way to stifle new entrants from the market from becoming a threat. And I don't think that the crypto legislation is any different, sadly. All right, let's talk a little bit about what are the uses of distributed ledger technology, we'll just call it DLT, and why it really would not serve the incumbents at all to make this stuff illegal. When you think about how money is moved, very little of it is sent between one person and another. Like a percentage is, but this idea that I'm going to send my friend money through a wallet to wallet is fine, but that's not really what the banking industry is looking to leverage here. Number one, payroll is a big deal. Many, many people in the world are employed. They get money from their company. This is done through payroll systems. And right now, the banks make money off the float. It takes several days. If you are an employer, you have to usually let go of that money a couple of days before it actually hits someone's bank account. Sometimes it's a little bit quicker, but the payroll is a big deal for companies, especially with many employees. There's also this idea of the supply chain where products and widgets and different components are sent from one country to another. There's a series of stops that most products make along the way. I did a separate video about trade finance stuff, which I'll put in the description. But this is a big deal for the financial services industries, how these products are sent along the way, how they're tracked, and then how they are funded. So we live in this world of credit. Businesses don't pay for everything in cash. So there's this world of trade finance where short-term loans are taken out to support the movement of these goods from one place to another. Another big deal. Blockchain technology, digital assets have a big role in that. There's also this idea of payments, specifically cross-border payments, that if I want to send money from one country to another, and I'm a smaller bank and I don't have a bank branch in that other country, I have to use these correspondent banks, which take a particular cut. And this ties into also into remittances, which is when one person sends money to another person, but it's generally in another country. And if you think about all the sort of labor pools of people who leave a country to go work in another country, this adds up to a pretty significant amount of money globally. So it is a big deal. All right, what are some of the problems that the financial services industry has that blockchain technology potentially solves? One, this idea of counterparty risk, where when we are two parties on either side of a transaction, generally one party has to trust that the other party is going to honor the agreement. This happens when you're buying and selling a stock or a bond. It also happens in all sorts of like the supply chain that, if I'm going to pay you to ship something from A to B, do I pay you in advance of you shipping it? Or do you ship it and then I pay you after it's received? Either way, people are assuming risk on one side of that that arrangement, which is referred to as counterparty risk. There's also these nostra vostra accounts, which are large amounts of money that correspondent banks have to put into accounts around the globe to support cross-border payments. It's trillions of dollars being locked up and held up, not really serving a function. Banks like to put their money to work to earn more money by essentially lending it out. And nostra vostra accounts are an unnecessary expense associated with being a correspondent bank. So that is a problem. There's also a lot of admin costs with settling transactions. So let's say you are in the stock or bond market and you are facilitating trades between two parties. Some person right now has to keep track of all that. Who's paid their bill, who still owes, do we settle up on these XYZ? Perfect candidate for some kind of automation. There's also human error, which is a factor in quite a few industries, including the supply chain, that sometimes the same invoice will get paid twice, or they'll forget to pay one, or they'll screw up the amount, all sorts of administrative mistakes that can happen. Might not be a big deal at a small scale, but when you're looking at a global system, these costs add up and can be significant. All right, so here's the challenge, and this is where regulations tie in. Remember, regulations are designed to protect the incumbent, but they have this challenge. How do we benefit from innovation without losing our market share? Because if you totally had a free market, the minute new technology comes along, the incumbents would be disrupted. This is kind of what happened with some industries when the internet came along. So, for example, email was very disruptive. So back in the day, I used to live in New York when I worked at a startup, and we were in this kind of crappy building down on Maiden Lane near Wall Street. And on our floor, the other tenant was a bike messenger service. And these guys were in and out all day long with their bikes, basically moving documents from one place to another. They made a lot of money. If you had visited New York at all during this time, this was like kind of late 90s, I guess, you had to really be careful when you were crossing the street, because if you were not, your bike messenger could run you over. This was a big business back then. There was a lot of bike messenger services. It was hardly the one on my floor was hardly the only one. And then pretty much email came along and this entire industry just went away. Like, there are no bike messenger services anymore, because not for documents from the corporate sector, because it wasn't necessary. You just simply email that. But that was one of these industries that was completely replaced by email. There's also the problem when it comes to the regulation of what happened to Blockbuster. So Blockbuster was a very large chain that rented movies, and they were in every single community, at least around the US, if not globally. And along comes Netflix, who was a competitor in that instead of you going physically to rent movies at this store, you actually you did it by mail. And Netflix would mail you these DVDs in the mail in this little sort of red packet. And Blockbuster was kind of in denial that Netflix was a legitimate threat. And it was a big deal when Netflix made the decision one day that they were going to stop, or they were going to split apart their streaming service from their mail-in DVDs. And at the time, I remember having conversation. People were like, that's pretty stupid. Who's going to do all this streaming stuff? They have this great thing going with the mail-in DVDs. But they were very forward-thinking and knew that the industry of movie watching was moving online, that as soon as the bandwidth problem was solved, meaning people had fast enough bandwidth at their house that they could stream these movies, we would see that people no longer felt like having to make the trip to Blockbuster. And then the thing that was always a pain about Blockbuster was that you had this hassle of having to return the movie. If you didn't return it, you got fined or charged more money, or in bad standing. There was all sorts of consequences for it. So streaming movies solved this amazing problem of the hassle of having to go get the movie and then having to return it. So it's absolutely a great example of how innovation solved a very painful and expensive problem for people. In this case, the expense was fines and their time, and it replaced it with a much more ideal solution. And Blockbuster, had the market share that, had they been forward thinking like Netflix, they would have been able to keep their share and evolve their business. Instead, they were in denial about the reality of the situation and ended up losing. I mean, there is no more Blockbuster anymore. They are done and they are out. So that brings us to this question of, knowing what we know, that the banking industry has certainly more influence politically than Netflix or a Blockbuster did, when the port bike messengers had no influence really politically. So those industries were made obsolete. So as this distributed ledger technology kind of becomes a bigger use and has a bigger role in our sort of society, how will regulations protect the incumbent? All right, this is my prediction. I don't I could be wrong. I don't have a way to necessarily prove that this is going to happen, but if I look at a couple of different data points, this is what I see lining up. So, number 1, it does not serve the financial industries, whether that's financial services, banking, or even the trade industries, to make crypto illegal. There are so many uses for this technology that to make it illegal would be very unproductive. Now, I think that the Congress or the Senate banking guy said that because this is part of a negotiation tactic. And then if you've done any training in negotiating at all, you know that you generally want to ask for more than what you want. And then you sort of negotiate and settle on actually what you really wanted. So they're throwing this, making it illegal out there, in my opinion, as part of a negotiating tactic to sort of scare us that and let us lead us to believe that this is what they actually want. But I don't think that they want that at all. There's too many incredible innovative uses that would be beneficial and profitable for quite a few industries that do have influence. However, when we think about, let's protect the role of the incumbent, what do the incumbent industries want? Well, they don't want new players to come in and steal their market share. So my guess is there will be regulations around licenses. What kind of license do you need to operate an exchange? What kind of license do you need to operate or to issue a stable coin, for example? This means that only players who are part of the system will be given the basically keys to benefit from the industry. So that doesn't necessarily affect you and I as citizens. If you're a retail investor, you probably aren't going to be issuing stable coins or an exchange. So how does regulation benefit banks in terms of the retail investor? Well, the more they have control over the on-ramps and off-ramps, and the more they have control over the transaction fees, the better. So, I don't have to be an accredited investor to buy a stock if I go to E-Trade and do it, because E-Trade has a license to be able to buy and sell those securities. So what if, as a retail investor, I was only allowed to use certain types of exchanges that had a very minimal, bare bones list of assets? If you're following the Ripple SEC case at all, there's this kind of ongoing debate about whether or not crypto will be classified as a commodity, which is basically money, or whether it will be classified as a security, which is essentially an investment contract. I actually think that it's narrow-sighted to assume that it will be one of those two things. There very likely could be a third classification that we'll just call digital asset, for lack of a better label, that has its own set of rules. And so we don't necessarily have to be limited to securities or currencies. There could very likely be a third option that is regulated in a different way. It probably would have some similarities to what we see in some of these other markets. Namely, and this is not my theory, I've heard this chatter for a while, we will see that only certain types of investors are allowed to participate in some exchanges. Namely, if crypto is labeled dangerous or full of risk that is beyond what a retail investor should be able to weather, it is likely that only accredited investors will be allowed to participate in certain types of exchanges. And Right now, that threshold in the United States, at least, is you need to have you can have a Series 7 license, but more commonly, the threshold of having $1 million in assets, not including your home, is one of the more common thresholds. So what if they raise that to 10 million, which has been thrown around, I think by Gary Gensler as well as some other people, as a way to further protect us. Remember, regulations are not about protecting people; they're about protecting the incumbent. So, and the incumbent sometimes just includes the uber wealthy, not always just the institutional banks. So, if that threshold were raised to $10 million, that is a way that you could lock most people out but not making it illegal. I mean, governments around the world love to introduce legislation under the guise of protection, aka the Patriot Act, but really there is a very different agenda going on behind the scenes. All right, so let's play this out a little bit. So let's say now that every asset is legal, but in order to buy and sell this asset, you need to be able to access a particular exchange. Now there are some exchanges that are available to anybody, but you could only buy and sell maybe, let's say, Bitcoin and Ethereum there. Just making these up for examples, or maybe they'll even have lots of like fun consumer type things. Like you could buy Avalanche on there, you could buy Dogecoin or whatever. But any of these assets that are going to be used by the institutional industries, maybe XRP, XDC, IOTA, Algorand, some of these technologies that are being used by companies to solve painful and expensive problems that aren't necessarily retail focused. What if those assets are only available for exchange on a particular place that requires you to have this accredited investor or institutional investor status? So it kind of would be like a DeFi exchange that operates on a public ledger, but is a walled garden that you have to have credentials to access. How do they issue credentials in this world? You get an NFT that essentially functions like your membership card, your access card, that you are only allowed to go to this exchange if you have this particular NFT. This is also how the ruling class can continue to dole out privileges and favors to people. Hey, I know you're not quite that $10 million cutoff, but if you do this certain thing for me at a certain time, your gift could be the ability to go and exchange at this, gated exchange. Because the reality is that most of these assets, let's say you have a whole bunch of XDC and it goes up in value, you can't go and buy groceries with XDC. You can't pay your rent. You can't buy gas. So it doesn't really have use to us as retail investors unless we're able to sell it. What if the only place to sell it, the only exchange that has any liquidity, requires a license? Now you could make the argument, well, all these black market things will exist, and maybe that is true, but this is then where you have what happened with Tornado Cash come in, where the government can now label certain types of exchanges as being participatory in organized crime or terrorism or whatever. And now all of these sort of unlicensed exchanges, if you're caught transacting via one of them, then you put yourself at risk for being arrested or whatever they decide would happen. So again, it's not illegal. None of these assets are illegal, but we are protecting you by saying that only certain types of assets are okay for retail. But if you are somebody who owns another asset and you're not an institutional investor or accredited investor, they could make it so we can't sell it. And that is a problem, because what good are these assets for you if you can't liquidate your investment at some point? Now, I don't love this theory because it makes me feel like I'm a little bit paranoid that the government is going to come along and try to screw us. But I just was reminded, as I was kind of coming up with some examples, of this thing that happened with the lotion bill years ago. Now, it didn't end up passing, but it was very clear that there was a very dishonest message being pushed, and that the Congresswoman, I think it was Dianne Feinstein even, or Barbara Boxwalter, I don't remember her name, somebody like that. They were pushing this, and they were absolutely stating that it was for consumer protection. But when you dug into it, it really wasn't at all. It was a tax on these smaller sized businesses that were a threat to the incumbent. They could have had, there were so many more options they could have pursued if consumer safety was really the issue. But instead, they had structured it in a way that would be financially impossible for a smaller company to get into the lotion making business if they chose to follow these rules. And that kind of jaded me on the role of regulations and how they are often presented as being one thing when really they are another. So I don't think crypto would become illegal simply because there's too many benefits to the institutional industries, financial industries, but it doesn't really serve them for us as retail investors to have ways to become wealthy, that they would prefer to keep us in our serf like peasant status where we work really hard, pay most of that money in some sort of a tax, and become distracted by media, sports, and other distractions that are intended to keep us away from things that could be truly life changing financially. Now, crypto, I think, was allowed to run its course for the last few years because they were sort of testing out the software, and a bunch of people got very wealthy, which sort of slipped through the cracks. And but I think that if crypto were to become mainstream and a lot of these technologies would become widely used, I do think that the incumbents would want a way to ensure that there isn't a distribution of wealth away from them to individual retail investors. Now, you can still make money in the stock market if you're not a retail investor, but it's not as easy because there are mechanisms in place that give advantage to institutional investors. And I think similar things will happen likely in crypto. Now, another question comes up is if you, let's say you already have these assets, would the government ever seize them? Would the government ever want to buy them back? I know that one way to pick a fight on crypto Twitter is to bring up Jimmy Valley's buyback thesis. And I'm actually part of the committee that's tackling how to value these assets. It makes no sense to me why people get so fired up and angry about it. But it has brought up a lot of these questions about like, what are all the scenarios by which the government could potentially take an asset? Like gold wasn't confiscated back in 1933. There was specific language that made that not the case. You were required to sell it back if you met certain conditions. You had to sell it at a specific price, an undervalued price, and then the government turned around and flipped it at a higher price. So they made a quick buck on that, that's for sure. And if you did not sell your gold back, there were some pretty serious consequences. A very significant fine. It was $10,000 at the time, but in our modern money, that's millions of dollars, like way more. And there was also a threat of jail time. So if you didn't sell your gold, did you really want to go to jail over it? I don't know. I don't want to. So the question that comes up with some of these assets, and this has come up with XRP, is, could they do something similar? I don't know if that would work in this day and age. We seem to be more aware and more awake and more likely to share. So instead of forcing you to sell it, what if they gave you a window of time and said, well, if you don't sell it by X period, we're going to lock you out of the exchange. I also think there's a pretty powerful organized crime syndicate in our world, sadly, and they will need to have ways to transact with each other. So to make crypto illegal means that if we only had CBDCs, for example, where people who work at the central bank and the employees of the central bank now have full ability to see every single transaction, how's organized crime going to continue to operate? Well, what if people like to talk about this public-private ledger, these two ledgers with XRP. I don't think that's the issue at all, as much as the exchange. So if there were now exchanges, there could be more than one, that required you to have credentials, aka an NFT, and some centralized entity was the one issuing these NFTs, that is a way to allow organized crime to do its thing. And that would allow the political class to issue favors to people who are doing their bidding for them. And it would be a way to keep retail out of the speculation side of things without making anything illegal. And they could say, hey, we're just protecting you. We're just trying to keep you from these dangerous investments that, Sam Bankman-Fried types of the world, they were out there doing these bad things, taking your hard-earned money. You're much better off being safe and going and buying some assets on this one regulated exchange. So that is my prediction. I don't think crypto will be illegal. Now, whether every country will do this, I'm not sure, but it will be, I think, far more effective to block your access to the ability to transact with some of these assets. This would allow the institutional side to do whatever they want. Trade finance can build out all the blockchain payment systems that they need. Remittances can continue. All these sort of behind the scenes and efficiency upgrades that the industry will benefit from. It will solve these problems that they want to solve, but it will protect them in two ways. One, it will make it very difficult for new players to enter the market, so the incumbents will be protected, just like a cartel does. There are often multiple entities in a cartel, and they have an agreement with each other that they're all allowed to participate in an industry, but they will lock out any new players from entering the market. I don't think this is any different, sadly. And then in terms of retail investors, it would be very bad PR for them to say that we are not allowed to own any of these things, especially if you've already been grandfathered in. But the more interesting question to me is whether or not they would lock us out of being able to sell it. Yes, there could be some kind of black market thing available, but if these black market entities, one, don't have any liquidity, that's a problem. Meaning, like, if nobody's using them, then how does that help you? And number two, do they give them this sort of stigma that something like Tornado Cash has been giving, which means that if you are caught using one of these unlicensed exchanges without, permission or whatever, then you are at risk of some kind of, criminal thing, you're breaking a law of some sort. Now, the reason why I bring this up and I want to talk about this is not because I'm trying to scare anybody. I just want to make sure that we're all aware of how they're playing this game, so that we can not, one, fall for it, and two, offer some alternatives so that we don't get locked out. That if we just pretend like Blockbuster that nothing really is going to happen, it's going to be fine, like Netflix isn't going to make it, then you're going to wake up one day screwed. I would like to help us all collectively avoid that. So this is why I think it's important to talk about all the things that could potentially happen, not from a place of fear, a place of worry. This is just me strategizing and scenario planning. What are all the ways that I think the incumbents could protect themselves at our expense? And how can we avoid that? Like, I'm not particularly interested in getting locked out of crypto or being screwed over by the financial services industry. But at the same time, I recognize they have a tremendous amount of power. But we're also smarter than them and understand this technology a little bit better. So we have the ability, I think, to anticipate some of their moves and prepare for them. Maybe we influence some of the Congress people who have some kind of influence, or maybe good guys. We use the power of the media. We use the power of social media to share some of these ideas, so that when somebody comes along and says, oh, we're trying to protect you from this really dangerous world of crypto, it's better if you're not allowed to access some of these exchanges because you're not an accredited investor, that we basically call them out on that BS and say, no, thanks. We're going to have a test that we create for each other. And anybody who passes this test gets this accredited investor status, or some other clever loophole that we look for and seek, so that they don't get to lock us out. Because I know that if they were to raise that threshold from $1 million to $10 million, a whole lot of people are going to get kicked out, and that would suck. So my intent here is not to make anyone scared or worried or paranoid about what I think some of these world governments will do in terms of regulation. I just want to anticipate their moves so that we can have a counter move. This is a game of chess. Nothing's done until it's done. And there are ways I think we can mitigate our own risk about getting locked out of potentially life-changing wealth, not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. So if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them in the comments. If you like the video, please like it, subscribe to the channel so that you can catch me in the next one. All right. Have a great day.